Welcome everyone, wherever you're dialing in from today. Thank you for joining us for the third webinar in Saul Ewing, Arnstein and Lair's CLE series, Key Legal Considerations for Businesses Reopening and Rebounding. Today's program will focus on business continuity steps for rebounding from the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Kermit Nash. I'll be your moderator today. I'm a partner in Saul Ewing, Arnstein and Lair's corporate practice group based in Minneapolis. I advise domestic and international clients a range of industries on legal issues connected with their business operations, mergers, acquisitions, governance, and risk management. I'm joined by my colleague today, Max Bremer, also a partner in the firm's corporate practice group. Max advises entrepreneurs and established companies in a variety of industries on key transactions throughout the business lifecycle, from formation to financing, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. Max is also based in sunny, beautiful Minneapolis. Before we begin, we've got some housekeeping for you. First, if you have questions, you'll note on your Zoom screen that we have an option to submit questions. I will be moderating those and grabbing those and answering questions as time permits. If we run out of time, we'll do our best to follow up individually via email. Our contact information is at the end. We're happy to interact with you. For those of you today who are looking for CLE credit, we have been approved for distance learning CLE credit in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, with applications pending in Minnesota and Florida. As a CLE provider, you must be able to verify your attendance. So at random points during this webinar, we'll display and announce two numeric reporting codes. You must record and report back to us using the CLA survey that you received in your webinar reminder earlier today. We will in turn send you your certificate of attendance once we receive your survey response. If you're not in one of those states listed, we'll be able to provide credit as we apply for it. Please be sure to respond to our CLE survey with your numeric codes within 5 days of the program. Within 48 hours of this program, you'll also receive a thank you for participating email that will include links to the webinar recording, the handouts, and the CLA survey. Please look for that and please fill it out. Quick legal disclaimer: wouldn't be a good CLE without a full disclaimer. The provision or receipt of the information in this presentation is not legal advice. It does not create a lawyer-client relationship and should not be acted on without seeking professional counsel who've been informed of specific facts. With that, let's begin. So these are interesting times. We have a lot of reasons to be joined today. Some of you are maybe talking about risk management processes. Some of you may be talking about reopening. But our agenda for today is focusing on three topics. When we're talking about considerations for rebounding, we're going to first talk about lessons learned, assess current risks and understand the current environment. Second topic will be analyzing your organization's business agility and talking about that in context of business resiliency. And we're going to determine critical areas for improvement. Next, we're going to talk about determining how your organization is best positioned to manage crisis in the future. Although we hope this is a one and done event, we suspect that this may be something on the minds of those thinking about how we reacted to this crisis and how we react to the crisis that may be around the corner. Next slide, please. So as an introduction, we're talking about a modern crisis, COVID-19. In many respects, this is something that no one had ever thought of. But in other respects, we have dealt with crisis before. Unlike most crises, there's an increased scrutiny on employee safety company-wide. Unlike weather events or events like the 2008 financial crash or 9/11, these are events that are caused by external forces. Health issues, including employee safety and the transmittal of a disease, is something that took many people by surprise. It created a lot of reasons for unplanned operational pivots, restricted a lot of business activities that most of us took for granted, and created massive, unprecedented disruptions in the supply chain. Not just supply chain that we would historically think of, but upstream, which is suppliers to your business, downstream, which is services and goods that need to get to your customers and clients, and midstream, which is your ability to staff and operate sufficiently. Next slide, please. So we call this a modern crisis, in which case the post-lockdown return to business isn't just an event. It's not a date on the calendar, it's a process. Many of you today are dealing with issues. You may be working from home or maybe working part-time from the office. But when you take some analysis on the numbers, over 2.7 billion people worldwide, which is 80% of the global workforce, has been impacted in some way related to COVID-19. The reintegration issues are vast. And if you participated in our prior seminars, you saw some of the key points with regard to labor and employment, force majeure clause, and subsequent CLE events that we are hosting, or talk about some other reintegration issues. But the current crisis is unique because while it's a health crisis, it's also a shock to the company and many companies, to the country, I should say. But it also tested long-held practices of how we felt that we were prepared for crisis, and that deals with not only operations, but financial, our markets, but also leadership. Next slide, please. So many factors go into this, but as we've been gleaning aspects from our clients' experience and our own experience, we're seeing a number of themes. Historically, most disruptions are upstream, meaning someone can't supply you with products. Some type of event happens where a hurricane or disruption isn't able to get products from point A to point B. That wasn't the case here. Instead, government shutdowns, led largely in the belief that the spread of COVID-19 required shutdowns, meant that certain industries were shut down almost immediately with very little warning. For example, hospitality and entertainment industries were decimated. Substantial amounts of business, estimated from anywhere to 79% of hospitality and food service, have been shut down and impacted dramatically. Also, delayed reaction supply chains surging upstream, meaning plant closures, people getting COVID-19, inability to get products where they need to go, unprecedented challenges to being able to get products where they need to go, and the workforce to do the work. Many companies had their workforce displaced and may not have been ready to work remotely. For those who were able to make the quick pivot, that didn't mean that they were alone. It meant that there was a reduction in force in some cases, austerity measures, and products that couldn't get to their clients. Many return to work issues, compounded by the need for critical equipment and supplies, is still a problem. How do we get masks? How do we get all the equipment that we need to get people back in the office? Next slide. So in our first part, we're going to deal with a couple different things, but first and foremost, I'm going to turn this to Max to talk about assessing current risks and understanding the current environment. Max? Thanks,
Kermit. Yeah, so as we think about, for some businesses that are that have remained open but are picking up now that the economy is starting to reopen a little bit, or some businesses that have been fully closed and now starting to open. Now is the time to sort of assess kind of what has happened over the past several months, and think about how you've addressed things, and sort of establishing processes and procedures to manage risk, and some of the issues we've faced as we move forward. I think that the first thing to think about, obviously, is to remain flexible and adjust to the changing circumstances. If we've kind of learned anything in the past 2, 3, 4 months, it's that things can change monthly, weekly, daily, even hourly in some cases. And whatever plans you had at the beginning of the year undoubtedly have changed. And so we're in a different situation, a different reality. As you move forward, anticipate that that things will not sort of remain the same as they are today. Hopefully they pick up and the economy is much stronger as we move through the remainder of the year. But the reality is that there could be another wave of things. The economy could be impacted again as we open up, or perhaps there's sort of a new crisis on the horizon that we don't even know about. So in any case, the idea is that obviously businesses need to remain flexible, adjust to changing circumstances in real time as they're happening. There's obviously, Kermit touched on this a bit, there's significant impacts to the employment force for businesses that have remained open. Obviously, they've had to manage through this already with providing safety for their employees. Businesses that are starting to reopen, re-engage, are having to think about how they can do that, whether they have the right amount of PPE, what it means to have employees back, how you can safely manage your workforce. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. It's a critical important topic. Some of our colleagues, partners had a great session on this just 2 weeks ago. If you weren't able to attend, I would suggest that you reach out through either the Q&A or after the program, and we'd be happy to send you the materials on that. But just want to highlight that given the importance of the issue. We will talk more about, in the slides to come, some of the local, state, and national laws that are impacting plans for reopening or continuing operations wherever you are on that spectrum. Obviously, vendor relationships and the supply chain has been stressed and challenged in this environment. We'll talk a little bit more later about how you evaluate where you are today and sort of plan for potential issues down the road. Obviously, customers are critically important for any business. Making sure you're in touch with your customers is and understanding what their needs and expectations are for the rest of the year, and being able to fulfill that. Fulfill their expectations is critically important. We'll talk a little bit about preparing for claims. One unfortunate aspect of this is we're sort of anticipating that there will be a pickup or a spike in litigation and adversarial type proceedings as companies assess kind of the damage of the last few months and how they can, companies have been in breach of contracts, maybe not because of their own fault, but just because of the reality of the situation, and being prepared for that, either defensively, if you're going to be subject to a claim, or perhaps offensively if you want to pursue a claim against a vendor or another third party. And then we'll talk a bit about sort of assessing the current situation in real time and learning from what's happening and adapting as best you can. Next slide, please. So I mentioned, businesses are being impacted by state, federal, and local laws. Obviously, we've all, some states have almost shut down completely. Other states not so much, but some cities within states have taken more stringent approaches to the crisis. So understanding what the local situation is, what your state permits, and perhaps federal or industry-wide regulations on how you can reopen is critically important. It's important for businesses to have somebody on the ground, especially if you have multiple locations, to understand what restrictions are in place and how you can reopen. For example, our office, Saul Ewing, we have 16 offices in 9 different states. Within each of those states, we've tasked at least one person to be the lead in understanding the local implications of regulations, how that impacts, whether we can be open and how we interact with clients and others from our own offices. And we're obviously helping to advise clients in those localities based on those same regulations. I have an example here on this slide. I'm in Minneapolis. Kermit and I are both in Minneapolis. There's an ordinance in place now that provides that if you're over the age of 2 and in a place of public accommodation, you have to have a mask on. Now, our office isn't a place of public accommodation, but I walked to my office today partially through a system of skyways. If you haven't been to Minneapolis, we have kind of a hamster wheel set up that connects all of all the buildings downtown. And those are places of public accommodation. If you're going to be walking through those, you need to be wearing a mask or potentially subject to a fine. St. Paul, our neighbor to the east, has a kind of a similar system in place, but it's different. It doesn't affect all businesses or all places of public accommodation, indoor places. And so understanding that even two cities right next to each other which are fairly similar, even in those localities. Even on things such as this, there's distinctions in how how they're treating things. Next slide, please. As we've touched on, the supply chain has been critically stressed in many cases, both upstream and downstream. So understanding where you are in relationship with especially your critical vendors, and whether they're able to fulfill your needs and their obligations to you is highly important. I'm sure many of you have already been through this process already, as we're a couple months into this. But if not, and if you have not yet been impacted by the inability to get critical goods, services from vendors, you should be having conversations with them now to understand what they anticipate they'll be able to fulfill for the remainder of this year. And particularly if things don't go as planned or as hoped or as expected, and there's another wave, understanding what their expectations and abilities will be under those scenarios is critically important for companies, management, and boards who are leading these companies. To the extent, or even if your suppliers tell you that they're going to be in a position to be able to fulfill their obligations for the remainder of this year, vetting and having alternative sources available makes a lot of sense to the extent your primary and preferred suppliers are not able to fulfill their obligations later this year. If you haven't already, you should be reviewing your contracts and understanding what your rights are relative to your vendors. We did a great seminar just last week on force majeure clauses. We won't talk about that in depth here, but just understand that, if your vendors are unable to fulfill their obligations and there are force majeure clauses in place in your agreements, they may have an out as it relates to their obligations. So you should read those, understand what they mean. Not all force majeure clauses are the same. This COVID event may or may not be covered under those clauses. So understanding what your agreements say is really important as you think about how you're going to move forward for the remainder of this year. And also, understanding for yourself whether you have committed to do something with a customer or have committed to take on services or goods from a vendor. If you're in a position because your customers are telling you they don't need product this year or don't need services, being in a position to understand whether you have rights under your agreements to get out of them it is critically important. Next slide. With customers, it's sort of a similar exercise, but really understanding what your customers' needs are, how they've been impacted by the crisis, what they anticipate they will be needing for the remainder of the year from you, and then whether or not you believe you can deliver on what they need is critically important. I'm sure many of you have had some of these conversations already. But if your customers are, now as they're sort of assessing what the remainder of the year looks like and believing their demand is going to be less, and therefore they have a lesser need for your product or your services, making sure you understand that so you can plan accordingly for the remainder of the year and have direct and transparent conversations with your vendors so you don't have a log jam coming up here at the end of the year where you have more product than you can deliver. And similarly, you should think about, to the extent you have contractual arrangements with your customers that provide for certain things that are going to come up later this year. If the reality has changed from what your agreement provides, now would be the time to try to get in front of that and renegotiate agreements if you can, and get different terms, or perhaps provide different and better terms for your customers if they're hurting and you're in a position to help them. Next slide. As I mentioned, we're anticipating, certainly our litigators are, who've been through other crises before, that there is the likelihood of increased adversarial activity as a result of this. So understanding that and being prepared on the front end is certainly wise. As part of that, you should be, as you're reviewing your contracts or having conversations with clients, having conversations with vendors, documenting those conversations, documenting agreements you're making. We have one client who is a vendor to a large national healthcare chain, health club chain. And we just recently negotiated an agreement whereby our client, the vendor, agreed to provide much better terms for the remainder of the year to its client, the health club chain, who, frankly, was shut down for 3 months, and its business was radically impacted. Our client was in a position to be gracious to their customer, wanted to help. Not just for customer relationship purposes, but kind of altruistic motives, and was able to do that. But I think the parties would have been happy to sort of move forward on a handshake basis. We kind of suggested that they ought to document that, in part because so everybody knows what the agreement is for the remainder of this year, but also because we're putting a shelf life on these kind of relief terms for the remainder of this year. And depending on what happens later this year, the parties can reassess and provide an extension or some other agreement. But documenting it allows us to have that conversation later this year when and if we need to extend those terms, or perhaps return to normal terms if the economy has improved as we're all hoping. You should also evaluate your policies, procedures relative to current practices. Obviously, if you have terms and conditions with customers that you're not able to fulfill right now, given current circumstances, you should think about changing those so you're not subjecting yourself to potential claims for failure to fulfill your own commitments. And similarly, if you're subject to terms and conditions with vendors, assess whether or not they're able to fulfill those, and how that impacts your arrangements, and whether or not potentially you might have a claim against them. Evaluate your insurance and your particular business interruption insurance, whether you have that, and whether it covers this situation. I think a lot of people are learning that even though they had business interruption insurance, the policies are written in a way that doesn't cover this current situation. So understanding your rights and whether you have a claim there is important. But that aside, to the extent you have a claim against a customer or other third party, or going to be subjected to one, you need to understand what your other insurance policies provide. So to the extent you need to tender a claim, if a claim or a threat has arisen, understanding what the timing is of your need to notify your insurer, and what sort of information you need to provide is important, so that you don't waive those rights. And then obviously, to the extent you can, make sure your employees are aware as they're having conversations with vendors and customers, that they're not waiving contractual rights inadvertently. I mean, everybody wants to be helpful right now. I think we're all in the same boat. Everybody understands that this has had a major impact on everyone, but not sort of affirmatively waiving things that you don't need to at this point. There's always a role to come back and provide, to the extent you want to do that, do it in writing, and make sure you've sort of assessed and vetted and understood the implications of whatever you're waiving before you present that to a third party. Next slide. And then finally, sort of spending some time as you're going through this, if you're reopening, or perhaps you've been open and now are have some time to sort of think about what has happened. We've now been in this situation for the last 2, 3, 4 months. While many of us, really couldn't have planned for this situation, it's happened. We're now kind of operating in real time. We have 2, 3, 4 months of experience to guide us on what has worked in this new environment. If we're all working from home, or you have a limited workforce, assessing what's not working and trying to improve that. We'll be talking about this more later in the program, but an important thing to stress here is that boards and management in particular have fiduciary obligations to their organizations, and they need to be sort of actively engaged in managing risk, assessing the current reality, and driving their organizations through this process. And to the extent they're not doing that on an active basis, not actively learning what is happening in real time and making decisions for the benefit of the company and its shareholders, there will be potential risk down the road. So we'll talk more about that as we get further into this, but something to keep in mind as we move through this, because unfortunately this, whether it's whether this crisis reemerges or it's a different crisis or something else completely down the road, there are risks out there that boards and management need to assess and manage through. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Kermit to talk about the second part of our presentation.
Well, thank you, Max. And noting for those of you who are watching on the screen, we've got a CLE reporting code on the bottom, so take note. Second thing I'll note here before starting the second section is we're making webinar history. Not only do we have a quote for Eisenhower and Mike Tyson in the same presentation, but they're on the same page. So, second section on agility versus resiliency is maybe a little bit of a nod to what a lot of you may have been reading about in a lot of blogs and articles, perhaps some other seminars, even on the news cycle, about this concept of agility versus resiliency and which type of organization have you created. And, frankly, we want to touch on that a little bit because it's a nice segue to enterprise risk management and the legal thread that weaves through all of that. And this is not necessarily endorsement of one or the other, but rather agility is simply the ability to move quickly, to navigate, think like a running back trying to make it through the line, or resiliency, which is the capability to withstand whatever may come your way. Both of those are very important, especially under a crisis. But I do think there's something that's missing, and this is something that Max and I have been seeing quite a bit and talking about with our clients, and that is there has to be a focus on stability, because without stability in organizations, it's hard to have either agility or resiliency. And so the next few slides, we're going to talk about how there's a legal thread that weaves through this and is very important in your assessment, not only what has been happening and what your current reality is, but taking those lessons learned and putting them into practice enterprise-wide, so that you can identify where you may have been caught maybe a little flat-footed, like many organizations were, or what did you do well? In which case, how do you learn from that, so that whether you are lacking in agility or lacking in resiliency, or you're actually strong in those areas, that you can fortify that going forward. Next slide, please. So I want to first talk about agility. And we talk about this in the sense of operational agility, because we don't want to exclude finance and the market, because they seem to all work together. And so the ability to pivot quickly is very important, but oftentimes it's important where you're trading for long-term stability versus short-term flexibility. And so in our world, we see that clients, whether it be from the goods or services side of the equation, this means different things to each company. But in the reality is that market forces creating this shift are something that you have to react to. And while we'd all like to plan ahead and say, yep, we had this in our playbook, we're planning for a pandemic in 2020, I don't think that's the reality. So one of the things that this particular crisis has done is that exposed a lot of the processes that those who are particularly in the goods side of the equation, that the lean and just-in-time supply chain processes were exposed. And because for some, it was an increased volume in demand, which they couldn't meet the demand that was happening in certain places. And we saw this in just a practical perspective of those who were seeing a lot of empty shelves in grocery stores and things like that. Also, in our case, we're seeing many supply agreements that went sideways because there's either a lack of supply or excess supply with almost no warning. And the strain that that caused on the respective companies that were not necessarily planning for it was profound. Also, for those of you who are on this webinar and maybe on the services side of the equation, this certainly impacted you too, because it's not just can you get a good from point A to point B to point C, but providing those services in a timely manner, which means moving your people out of the offices and having them work from home. Did you have the IT infrastructure? Did you wait for those tech upgrades until 2021 and wish you hadn't? So these are some very daunting and very real questions that people are still trying to figure out. And understanding that agility can benefit any organization that needs to move quickly, that's not always the case, especially for organizations that have tons of infrastructure, tons of employees that have to operate manually within an organization. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that I referenced was just kind of the practical, but the reality is that the future is uncertain, it's increasingly fast, and Max made a point earlier, which was largely focusing on core customers. We don't want to alienate non-core customers along the way or forego opportunities. Many people in the sales cycle are trying to sign up deals and sign contracts and have terms in there which require certain performance at a certain time. Agility requires you to have the ability to move product into other areas or repackaging or providing services in a different way. You want to refinance your house, you have to do that electronically. How do you do that? So being able to identify those challenges to operations and infrastructure is going to be key as we look ahead and plan, whether it be your operating plan, your budget, how you staff, and even how you insure your business. Next slide, please. Operational resiliency is on the other end of the spectrum, which is we have to rely on the foundation of the business to be strong. And we do that in a number of different ways. Infrastructure, be your skilled labor, multiple plants, locations. You rely on third parties, which are key vendors or clients where you're relying on them taking a certain supply. And even those banking relationships where you believe that you've got a strong line of credit or you've got an existing facility that allows you to keep the lights on, keep the rent going. That operational resiliency is something that we hear a lot about in the market, especially public companies when people are trying to see what's around the corner. How are these companies operating? How many flights did Delta decide to cancel this month and terminals are not going to? Do they have the resiliency to withstand this? And we also look to them for indicators to see, hey, are they seeing something that we aren't seeing? Next slide, please. So the challenges with resiliency have to do with the fundamentals of an organization. When one critical part of the infrastructure is impacted or even eliminated, can the foundation withstand this shift? People don't realize that even though you might be shopping the grocery stores and see empty shelves and create some frustration, there's a host of supply chain issues that are leading up to getting that product onto the shelf, almost all of which are under contract. Same with services. Yet, if your customers leave, the laws change, and an unmitigated crisis hits, that's when we get empty shelves. That's when we see disruptions in the supply chain. Resilience can often prevent organizations from making quick pivots. And so, if resiliency and agility are the yin to each other's yang, the question would be is when you're doing an assessment of your organization and how did it operate during a crisis? Were we too rigid? Did this create notions of are we too big to fail? Or were we too nimble, meaning that we had to alienate customers to meet kind of the short-term need, and did we create damage for our organization and the long-term relationships that we had? Next slide, please. So as we're talking about some of these factors and which is it, agility or resiliency, and our comment, which is require stability at all parts of the organization, this is leading up to a risk management assessment we're going to spend most of our time at the end. One key component is you have to be able to build a team. that understand organizational stability is key. What does that mean for your organization? Well, it may not be one size fits all, but it also does require confidence in relationships both upstream and downstream. And for many years, we have been talking about how we work together and we build our own infrastructure, kind of build our own house. But many people don't realize that a lot of planning goes into processes that rely on third parties as well. Next slide, please. So the operational strength that I think we need to focus on, which is not just a risk management and assessment that we've done well or haven't done well through the crisis, but it's a concept that we use here, which is typically not all business issues are legal issues, but all legal issues are business issues. We see that changing. In crisis, all business issues are ultimately legal issues, whether that be how you deal with crisis management. Do you have a plan? Do you have a succession plan? Human resources, being able to make sure that labor is in the right place at the right time, doing the right things. Are you optimizing their experience, being able to make sure that you're meeting the demands of your clients and customers, supply chain risks that we've been talking about, and just some of the simple financial risks, which is if you are completely shut down. If you're in the movie theater business, only recently have they been talking about how to get people back in the theaters. The restaurant industry, most people will say that you need to have at least 90% of your tables filled in order to break even, let alone to make a profit. Reopening with 25% or 50% just doesn't cut it in this market. So the question is, are we resilient enough? Are we agile enough? Or are we strong enough with stability that we need to make sure we withstand the crisis? Next slide, please. So the action items here to make sure that we're building stable organizations, and whether you need to be more agile or more resilient, is revisiting some of these things and looking at them in a way that you probably haven't looked at them in the past. Today, we're seeing tons of contracts that have been breached. And at our last seminar, we talked about force majeure clauses, where force majeure was used as an excuse to not perform on time. And I think a lot of people have a misconception that force majeure means that you may not have to perform. That's not the case. Force majeure is that you do not have to perform within a certain time period based on certain conditions. It's not a complete excuse to performance, and it doesn't allow you to walk away from a contract. So being able to be nimble enough to renegotiate those contracts, whether it be upstream or downstream, is going to be critically important. Also, it's requiring a lot of folks, we see this in particular in food and ag, reconsideration of exclusive relationships, meaning do we have one customer or a small number of customers where we provide all of our supply? If one of them were to go away or they're not able to take our product, are we in trouble? And so having the ability to pivot quickly and actually negotiate and discuss by having an open conversation with your customers and suppliers about, in the event this happens again, how are you planning on trying to pivot, whether you need our product or not, and how do we make that decision? Sometimes quickly, far more quickly than you ever have before. Agreeing on contingency plans. That quick pivot, that may impact you, but that also is going to impact someone downstream. And having an open conversation about that is something that most companies haven't considered for a while. Perhaps since 2008, maybe it was Katrina, maybe it was other types of natural disasters that radically impacted their business. Well, even though COVID-19 is not a natural disaster in the traditional sense, it was a disaster to many businesses. Next slide, please. So one of the segues we want to make is talking about risk management. And I think we need to have a quick reminder on how this has been viewed historically. In the past, and I say in the past, it's not that long ago, risk management used to be something that was identified and destroyed because most organizations had no tolerance for risk. Well, in the digital age, that's changed quite a bit. It's no longer just the CFO and the audit committee that are trying to smoke out risk inside of organizations. Today, it's enterprise-wide with a common legal thread that weaves from the top to the bottom. The primary concern that we have is that the threat to continued business operations don't necessarily think about the unforeseen risks. If COVID-19 did anything, and I think it might be too soon to start claiming silver linings, but one of those that may come out is we weren't planning on it, but now we know what might happen. So we're going to wrap this into our strategy, we're going to wrap this into our planning and see where those threats are. Not just with our contracts, not just with our workforce, but with our customers, having those conversations. Infrastructure. Are we subject to cyber threat now that our workforce is displaced? And the last one, which I think, frankly, is overlooked sometimes, which is how does our competition react to this? Do we need to reach out to competition? Do we need to work together in some cases? Antitrust considerations notwithstanding, we've seen some amazing stories how competitors in the current crisis found ways to work together to make sure they're supporting each other's business by getting products to the ultimate customers. With that, I'll hand it back to Max to talk about our last topic when not just thinking about risk management in the past, but how we're viewing risk management going forward. Max?
Thanks, Kermit. Right. So now we've kind of talked about sort of the current situation, looking at risk management, some of the historical antecedents, and now sort of thinking about how the current situation informs the way we're going to think about this going forward. We've got some definitions here on this slide about just as sort of a basis for thinking about what risk is and how we think about it. ISO 31000 defines it as the effect of uncertainty on objectives, which can either be a sort of a negative or positive effect. And TOSO defines it as the possibility that events will occur and affect the achievement of strategy and business objectives. And of course, that's what we're trying to ascertain, how those business objectives and strategies will be affected, and how best to manage and mitigate that. Next slide, please. And this sort of summarizes, again, kind of something Kermit already discussed. But historically, I think organizations thought about risk as something to avoid. Really since kind of the great crash of 2008 and the adoption of ISO 31000, we sort of see that organizations are thinking a little bit differently about risk, and not so much. I mean, obviously, you'd like to avoid negative impacts, but trying to understand, mitigate risk as much as you can, but manage through it. Understand that it's sort of part of the business environment, and understand that it's something that you have to manage through, and that you can't. The best business decisions aren't necessarily those that completely avoid risk, but deal with it and manage through it. Next slide, please. Here's a great quote by Admiral Stockdale that kind of emphasizes some of this, which is that you need to assess and confront the brutal facts of your current reality, but not lose faith that you'll prevail in the end. And that's really what we're sort of risk management is about. Obviously organizations need to have confidence and trust that ultimately they will prevail, but hope and faith are not enough to get you there. You need to assess the current reality and manage and plan through it. Next slide. And again, sort of more backdrop here, but as we think about risk management, maybe just to emphasize the point again, I think the great companies, the ones who do the best job of this, are not those who form a process and procedure around completely avoiding risk. The best ones sort of do the best job of taking risks, and the best way to do that is to sort of understand your current environment, understand where things are going, what risks are out there, and how you can sort of best manage through that. Next slide. So let's talk about the sort of the organizational roles in managing risk. Obviously, it's sort of the board and management who have primary responsibility for that. As Kermit mentioned, it's really an organizational mindset, but that mindset is set by the board and management. The board's responsibility really is to provide some clarity and direction around risk management and how the company will manage through that, without sort of good clarity around who has what role and who is responsible for what, you'll have, potentially redundancy in place and different voices speaking on the same thing, which is not helpful. So the board sets the standard about how the organization will view and respond to risk, whether it's sort of more aggressive or more conservative. And with that in mind, it then sort of needs to pick the right leadership to steer the ship. And so not have, super aggressive executives in place if a corporation wants to have a more conservative mindset. It should require from management a comprehensive plan about managing through risk, and then require accountability for that. But not just from management, should require accountability from the board itself as to how it responds and reacts to risk, and how board members, how engaged they are in helping the company think through this process. The board should also be involved in measuring risk and then identifying successes and failures. Next slide. So, as we mentioned before, it's really the board and management who have the fiduciary obligation with respect to the corporation, or with respect to the organization and its constituents. It is they potentially who will have liability if the corporation or the organization was not thoughtful about the way in which it approached sort of the current situation and planning for the next. I think it's fair to say that not a lot of us had anticipated this particular crisis, or certainly the magnitude of it and its impact on not just specific companies, but the economy in general. But sort of given what we now know, it's not appropriate so put your head in the sand and assume that this isn't going to happen again. And indeed, potentially we may have, second and third waves of this particular crisis, but there may be other pandemics and other crises to come down the road. Boards should infuse their own conversations, but their plans with management with sort of thoughtful consideration of the current situation and how they're going to address things on a go-forward basis. And if they don't, there will be potential liability and risks from shareholders. The cases in this area sort of are all around, why the board members hadn't anticipated particular issues. There's a number of cases around this that crop up in fiduciary obligations of director type lawsuits. And it's all about kind of, to the extent the board didn't know, why didn't they know, why didn't they have the right process in place to anticipate these things? And so having a good process in place, to the extent you can, being engaged, being involved, asking the right questions of management, are sort of critical to mitigating that, not just for the business's success going forward, but as a liability protection mechanism for directors. Next slide. The management's role, to contrast a bit with the board, is really, they have fiduciary obligations to the organization as well. Their role really is to implement the board's strategy, to identify risks, to bring them up to the board, to in some cases, to create the plan that the board adopts, to have good communication with the board, to keep the board apprised of what's going, and to make sure that they're sort of infusing the rest of the organization with sort of the operational mindset of how to plan and manage and mitigate risk. Next slide. Actually, that's back to you, Kermit.
All right, thanks, Max. And one little side note, and we don't have a slide on this, but I think for some of you who are wondering, well, we do have some type of risk matrix, or we have some type of a risk planning tool. We think that we're prepared. Ernst & Young, and it's not a commercial for EY, but they do a very nice job on a global survey where they survey up to 3,000 companies every year worldwide, and they find a staggering number of companies, in particular boards, feel that they're unprepared for crisis. And I'm not going to start quoting the statistics, but it's always north of 50% of organizations feel like they're not prepared for some major crisis. In the last few years, I think most of us have been really focused, maybe even laser focused on cyber risk, because the digital age is just caught up with us so quickly that most companies traditionally have not been able to keep up with it. Well, the reality is that many organizations still are unprepared for some of the traditional risks, but now that this risk has occurred, we're not going to be able to hide behind it being an unforeseen risk anymore. So from the company risk profile perspective, I think one of the things that requires some laser focus, either as you're in planning or sitting in the boardroom or thinking about how do we integrate the entire organization into this process, is to identify risk. And now the reality is that the risk spectrum is limitless. You can sit in a room and think about every possible thing that could go bad in your organization, but that actually is part of the function, which is, look, pandemic probably wasn't high on the list, but it was high enough where it shows up in a lot of insurance policies, either as an exclusion or maybe it was included depending on your business. But that profile does require you to look at major risks, but also look at risks that are inherent in the company's strategy, whether you've thought about them or not. And one of the questions that actually was presented to us is whether or not, you're doing this on an internal basis, but does it require an external review? And if we have time at the end, I think we can address that. But the reality is that we think that there's going to be a new phase here where if you're not engaging outside advisors to take a fresh look, if you will, at the respective risk profile you have in your business processes, even your contracts, that may be required. We've been contacted by boards to come in and do an independent review to see if we deem that they are prepared for risk. And that's something that we're probably going to see more and more of as time goes on. So that doesn't include just short-term risks, but also long-term risks, known and unknown. Everything is fair game these days. Next slide, please. So Max referenced the COSO standards, and one of the things they talk about is the risk profile and what is the tolerance for an organization for certain types of risks. And so understanding and being able to categorize those risks. So if you are sitting in a position where your contract obligations are to fulfill contracts, you're looking at contracts, those need to be looked at quite carefully because a lot of the contracts that we've seen historically don't necessarily take into account these risks or what happens if there's a material adverse event. Max and I are first and foremost M&A and corporate lawyers, and so we think about this in the context that if you're buying or selling a business or you picked up a portfolio company, those contracts may have a clause which for some time after the respective acquisition, if a material adverse event were to occur, in which case arguably COVID-19 is a material adverse event, that could have implications on how the respective treatment of escrow, earnout, working capital adjustments may be taken into consideration. So not to get too deep in the M&A world weeds, but that's something that people need to be mindful of if that's part of your world. Also just the exposure in the business. And there's certain types of risks that some companies just take on, and that's part of their business. That's how they make money. They take on risk for third parties, but some companies can tolerate a certain level of risk and others cannot. And understanding the difference is going to be critical. Next slide, please. So part of this comes to planning. And to kind of hook back to the Eisenhower quote, plans mean nothing, planning is everything. So making sure that your organization is utilizing identification tools. Also, for those who are public companies, there's going to be a reporting aspect that's going to be scrutinized more closely. We're going to be seeing second quarter results here soon. And so a lot of questions are going to be, how are these risks going to be reported? How do companies react? How are they impacted? And I think the truth is going to be that there's going to be a lot of reporting on things that we're not necessarily foreseeing and how companies are reacting. Also, we see this quite often now, which is the term risk velocity. So it's one thing to identify a risk. It's entirely different to see how quickly that risk can come upon you and actually impact your business. So in the cyber world, we'll learn that someone had a hack, but the hack happened 18 months ago, and someone has been residing inside of a company's system for some time, and nothing really happened until the worst possible time. So that velocity may be low, but some velocity is quite fast, meaning all of a sudden if your customers are shut down and you can't deliver to a restaurant, that velocity is probably faster than you ever anticipated. Next slide, please. So one of the key issues that we look to, and this is not us borrowing a page from litigation handbook, but the question is who owns that risk? Who is ultimately accountable when things are not going right? And so part of the planning process is that from a top down, bottom up, boards certainly set the tone at the top. Management is responsible for executing on that strategy, but it involves everybody, whether it be the person walking the floors of a plant, someone who might be sitting at a desk in the front and not necessarily the back, the carpeted part of the building versus the cement part of the building. Everyone has to take a role. Now, it doesn't mean everyone's got responsibility for doing something or sitting in meetings all day long, but there has to be a risk hierarchy. And accountability is going to be driven. In recent cases, Max alluded to some, are going to implement, hey, you may have had some protection board in the past, but if the board isn't asking the right questions about who is ultimately responsible for making sure we're not only identifying it, putting in a plan, but then executing it, there's not going to be a lot of sympathy for a company that's been found to be lacking in their preparation and planning. Next slide, please. So we have an expression that if you can't measure it, it doesn't really have a lot of value. So some of the tools that are available from third parties and some organic tools the company use to measure this risk is going to be really important. What I found just delightful, and this is a shout out to those who are from the insurance world that are on the webinar today, is that a lot of insurance providers and their partners in brokerage are equipped to do this. And sometimes it's part of the services. And so for many companies, they may not be aware of this, but utilize the tools that are available to you, because no one can measure and manage a risk profile than an insurance company that is aware of most risks. And so take that and have that conversation about risk appetite and risk tolerance. Next slide, please. So the next 5 points, some of this we'll leave for your reading pleasure for later, but there's 5 points I think that are really key from action items on how you implement risk management. The first is just the stress test, which is who's on the team, how are we going to do it, how do we identify those risks, let's go through scenarios, let's see what's going to impact the company's health the quickest, but also the most profound, and that'll include impact on cash flow and things like that, but also assess the impact on customers. Next slide. Stability. Going back to our second part, talking about if you're going to be agile or if you're going to be resilient, you need to have stability in the company and taking these steps. And some of these practical items are something that you may take for granted every day, but they need to have a slightly different view, which is looking at your form agreements. If you're using a form for some type of agreement that's been in place for 10 years, it's probably obsolete and you may not even know why. So having a fresh set of eyes, take a look at that, make sure things are current, compliant, even with some of the new laws that are going to be coming, is going to be really important. Also, if you're in the, not so much the services, but in the goods space, multi-sourcing your supply, multi-sourcing, being able to pivot where you get your products to, monitoring the health of suppliers and customers, bringing on an analyst internally if you don't have a third-party service to see how your customers are doing. Ask questions, sometimes difficult questions, about how their business is doing. And then train your team. Make sure that they're being able to understand, identify risk. And this is even more important in the service industry, which is sometimes you don't have the ability to see how these non-public companies are doing because they don't have 10Qs and 8Ks that are being filed so you can see online or measure their stock price. You're going to have to get out of your comfort zone and ask questions that you may not have asked before about how they're doing. Next slide, please.
Hey, Kermit, let's we should mention the CLE code here quick.
Oh, sorry.
09295 is the second code.
Very good. Thanks, Max. Keeping me honest. Next is the planning matrix. If you don't have this, part of it includes a continuity plan. This is something that either you should develop, reach out to your counsel. Happy to take questions afterwards or independently of this, but having that crisis plan and having a business continuity plan, they're not the same. They work together, but for the most part, that continuity plan is going to take into consideration lessons learned and how we roll those forward to make sure you have a healthy organization that's withstanding the storm. Education of your team of how that plan works, being able to summarize that plan into something which is simple, usable and not overly redundant. We have some plans that make good doorstops because they're so thick, but when you need to move quickly and to determine what do we do in times of crisis, those policies and those particular action plans need to be efficient. Next slide, please. One more slide, thanks. This might be one of my favorite parts, and we do this for some clients, and I think we're going to see a surge in this. And if you're in the consulting business and you do these simulations, it's going to be a good year for you, and that is conducting what we call war games. Most people look at this and say, how can this possibly benefit my business? But it's a useful enterprise. Usually these are done on a weekend, not necessarily during a work day, but it involves tier one management, sometimes all the way down to, kind of the rank and file employees. But conducting a simulation, what do you do in the event something catastrophic were to happen to the organization? How does each person conduct their role? How do they fulfill their role? And a lot of people look at that and kind of scratch their head and say, is this really a good use of our time? A lot of the data that we're seeing now for companies that actually conduct these types of simulations benefited enormously during the last crisis. Because even though it wasn't necessarily a weather crisis or an economic crisis, it was a health crisis. And so most people realized, hey, we really benefited being able to have that education, have the ability to have run through it, stress test, see what works, what doesn't work, highlight who's really engaged in the process and those who aren't. And for many simulations, that'll also include being able to contact vendors and third parties and tell them you're conducting a stress test on your infrastructure. Many third parties will be very welcome and want to participate in that. Next slide, please. And lastly, Max alluded to this, but I think it bears repeating, review your insurance portfolio. In light of going through and kind of gleaning through what works, what doesn't, where do you have exposure, where do you have gaps, having that discussion, understanding the risks, educating your insurance provider and broker is going to be key. We find that many times that insurance brokers can actually help educate on key clauses in contracts with regard to the limits that companies agree to in contracts every day, or maybe the limits that you require a third party to have. And then my favorite, which is often overlooked, which is identify where third-party policies may cover your company and your operations, even though they're held by somebody else. So again, the underlying theme here is that education is key, and making sure that everyone understands how does this all work is critically important. Next slide, please. So we're coming to the end, and we've all heard the analogies and the quotes about the failure to plan as a plan to fail, but an important note is that we're living in a hyper-transparent world right now. Mark Twain once said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting new shoes on. And so for you, the reputational risk, if you're not prepared or things are not being handled properly, can create damage to your business, which really is not economic in the first instance, but it can be reputational, which is obviously very important. In the age of social media, information get out quickly, whether it be a disgruntled employee or a customer or someone who just wants to take a pot shot at your business for some reason. This is important. So planning for all aspects of this and including as many people as possible is key. Next slide. Okay. So we did have some questions in. I'm also mindful that we've exceeded our time, and we'll try to get back to you. I apologize. Max will say that I was a little long-winded, but in closing, this is the conclusion of our seminar. We'll try to get back to those who have questions. Our contact information is available. Contact us anytime. Please keep an eye out for the thank you email that'll be coming with a link to materials provided today. Be sure to complete the CLA survey when that comes if you're looking for your CLE credit as well. Finally, if you haven't done so already, be sure to register for our next webinar in our weekly series, Compliance Considerations and Enforcement Trends Surrounding the CARES Act, which is scheduled for next Thursday, June 18th at 1 p.m. and I believe that's Eastern time. So again, next Thursday, June 18th, Compliance Considerations and Enforcement Trends Surrounding the CARES Act. Thanks so much for your time. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you.